Boris Johnson set out in 2019 to deliver Brexit and impregnate the sofa, possibly. But today, the case of Boris Johnson, this man whose political career has lurched from landslide victories to scandal-ridden resignations, and now he's become a persona non grata within the very ideological movement that he, in many ways, birthed. It's a striking moment when Reform UK, the insurgent party that seeks to outflank the Conservatives on its right to deliver Brexit as Boris attempted to do, turns its fire not on Keir Starmer or the Labour government, but on Boris Johnson. And according to Zia Yusuf, the party's chairman, Johnson will be remembered as one of the most damaging prime ministers in British history. That's quite an accolade considering his competition. What about Liz Truss? Yusuf's critique is relentless. Johnson, he claims, was a total betrayer of Brexit voters, overseeing a net migration increase that dwarfed expectations, promising economic growth outside the EU while failing to deliver a coherent plan. And worse still, in Yusuf's eyes, Johnson engaged in public spending levels very much like the Soviet Union, hardly the image of a torchbearer of small state conservatism. And yet, isn't there something fascinating about this sudden eagerness to erase Johnson from the pantheon of right-wing leaders? Johnson was, after all, the man who carried Brexit across the finishing line, secured an 80-seat majority, led the country through the pandemic, ushered in an agreement with Reform UK's predecessor, the Brexit Party. Granted, his record is checkered, but why now? Why this level of vitriol now? And one explanation lies in the growing nervousness within Reform UK, and for the first time, the party has outpolled the Conservatives in a YouGov survey, reaching 25% to the Tories' 21%. And if such figures materialised in an actual election, Reform could theoretically command between 140 and 200 seats. Grandiose predictions of 400 MPs are, of course, fantastical, but the momentum is undeniable, even given the constraints of the first-past-the-post system. Yet, what Reform UK needs most is credibility, and attacking Boris Johnson serves as a ritual purification, a means of demonstrating ideological purity. By rejecting Johnson, Reform UK positions itself as the true Conservative Party, not just an anti-immigration pressure group. And more interestingly, the party has extended an olive branch to figures like Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, who has become the darling of the right since her hardline stance on immigration saw her excommunicated by the Tories. And this signals that Reform is not merely chasing voters, it's actively pursuing high-profile defections from within the Conservative Party itself. There is another more tantalising possibility. Boris Johnson is up to something. Recent reports indicate he had lunch with Reform UK's chief fundraiser Nick Candy in January, and while Yusuf has explicitly ruled out Johnson rejoining Reform, the meeting raises eyebrows. Johnson has form when it comes to surprise political resurgences, and just as his opponents think him finished, he re-emerges like an Old Testament figure, penitent but unrepentant, ready to seize an opportunity. Could Johnson be testing the waters? If the Conservatives collapse further under Kemi Badenoch's leadership and Reform UK gains real momentum, might he position himself as the unity candidate to prevent Farage from becoming the standard bearer of the right? His silence in response to Reform's attacks suggests calculation rather than capitulation. And it keeps him in the headlines, doesn't it? Meanwhile, Kemi Badenoch, now leading the Conservatives, is also engaged in a delicate balancing act. She's making a concerted effort to disavow the legacies of her predecessors, particularly Johnson and Theresa May. Her argument that the Conservatives have failed on Brexit, immigration and economic planning. She is not wrong. Net migration soared to 685,000 in 2023, far exceeding the Brexit-era promises. Economic stagnation continues to plague the country, and the net zero policies enshrined under May have caused internal divisions. Badenoch's approach is a gamble. She seeks to draw a clear line between her leadership and the failures of the past, much as Tony Blair did with Labour in the 1990s, except that Tony Blair the Labour Party had not been in power immediately before Tony Blair. But Reform UK's rise complicates the strategy. The more she criticises past Conservative governments, the more she affirms Reform's argument that the Tories have lost their way. In the end, it's not just about Boris Johnson, it's about the future of the British right. Reform UK's surge is a warning shot across the bow for the Conservatives. A fractured right benefits Labour, and Keir Starmer has already begun targeting Reform UK, aware that it could siphon votes from the Tories and the disaffected working-class Labour voters. Yet, Reform UK remains a volatile entity. Its success is tied almost entirely to the charisma of one person, to Nigel Farage, and if he falters or if internal divisions emerge, the party could unravel as quickly as UKIP did post-2016. As for Boris Johnson, he will bide his time. His silence now is deafening. But in politics, silence is often the prelude to something louder. Whether he attempts to take control of the Conservative Party, flirts further with Reform UK, or disappears into lucrative obscurity, one thing is certain: the battle for the future of the British right is only just beginning, and it is beginning now.